The Humiliated Father IV, Part 3 of 4. You see, I come back, as I often do, and as after all I almost always do, to articulating the ABC of things. It is not solely for the pleasure of spelling things out, even if that does exist, but this allows for true questions to be asked in their altogether rawest form. The true question that is asked is not, is that it, psychoanalysis, the place where it starts in the final analysis and introducing of the subject to her his destiny? Of course not. That would be to place ourselves in a demiurgic position that has never been the one occupied by the analyst. But, hence, to stay at this level of absolute point of departure and of huge significance, there is a kind of formula that has value in its ability to shake off completely naturally these ways of asking the question that are as valid as any others. It was before we thought we were so smart and so strong that we could talk about I don't know what that could be normal. In fact, we have never thought that we were so strong and so smart so as not to feel that our pen wobbled a bit every time that we tried to deal with this subject of what it is to be normal. But Jones wrote an article on this. It has to be said that he was not faint-hearted. It also has to be said that he came out of it not so badly. But also we can see the difficulty. Whatever it is that we have to put the emphasis on, the problem is that it is only actually via an evasion that we can even bring into play any notion in psychoanalysis of normalization. It is via a partialization of theory. It's when we look at things from a certain angle, when, for example, we start talking about instinctual maturation as if that was what it was always about. Hence, we end up with these extraordinary inferences confined to moralistic preaching, the nature of which inspires only mistrust and recoil. To bring in nothing more than a normal notion of whatever that relates in whatever way to our practice, when what we discover is exactly to what extent the so-called subject said to be normal is exactly what has come to inspire in us, as to what its appearances allow for, the most extreme and the most convinced suspicion, as to its results. We have to sort out, after all, whether we are capable of employing the notion of normal for anything appearing on the horizon of our practice at all. So, let's limit ourselves for the moment to the question: is the effort of deciphering something that locates the figure of destiny what is the destiny? Can we say that the charge we have taken of it allows us to obtain what? Let's say the least drama possible, the inversion of the sign. If the human configuration that we are addressing is the drama, tragic or not, can we be content with this goal of the least drama possible? A well-aware subject, a well-aware one is worth two, will contrive to pull out their little pick-up stick out of the pile. Why not, after all? Modest intention. That has never corresponded to our practice either, as you well know. That is not it. But I claim that the door through which we can enter in order to say that the only things that make good sense, I mean that give us the sense that we are following the thread of what we are trying to say, is this. Something that, as always, is closer to the point for us than this point at which the so-called evidence is just dumbly captured. That which is called common sense, or just dumbly where the crossroads begin, i.e., in the present case, between destiny and the normal. There is all the same something we have discovered, we have learnt to see in the figure of the symptoms, something that relates to this figure of destiny. Here is all the same something. It's that we didn't know it before, and now we know it. And in such a way that through this knowing we can neither place ourselves on the outside nor allow the subject to put themselves to one side and expect it to carry on working in the same way. This is to put it in an altogether absurd and crude way, for the reason that the fact of knowing or not knowing is essential with these figures of destiny. It is not that the well-developed figures that are myths pertain to language, but that they pertain to the implication that the subject is caught up in language, and in the speech game to complicate things further. The pertinence to the subject of a particular signifier, the figures that are developed in which there are necessary irreducible points, major points, interfacing points, that are the ones that I have tried to make figures for in the graph, for example. An attempt about which it is not a question of knowing if it is shaky, if incomplete, if it could not be much more harmonious, sufficient, be constructed and reconstructed by someone else, about which I simply want to evoke here what is aimed at, because this aim of a minimum structure of these 4, of these 8 interfacing points, seems to be necessitated just by the confrontation between the subject and the signifier. And it is already a big ask to be able to sustain the single fact of the necessity of the Spaltung of the subject. This figure, this graph, these located points allow us to reconcile our experience of development with the true function of what is trauma. Isn't trauma simply that which creates an eruption at a particular moment, has in some way cracked the kind of structure that seems to be imagined as whole? Since that is how the notion of narcissism has been used by certain people. It's that certain events come to be located in a certain place in this structure. They occupy it. They take on the signifying quality that commands this place in a specifically determined subject. This is what creates the traumatic quality of an event. Hence, the value of returning to the mythic experience. You should realize that we are not so well placed in relation to Greek myths, because we have plenty of variations, even some that are not too bad, but, if I may say so, they are not always good variations. I mean that we cannot make guarantees about the origins of the variations. In short, these are not contemporary or colloquial variations. They are arrangements that are more or less allegorical, romanced, and of course that is not utilizable in the same way as such and such a variation collected in situ could be, as offered by the mythical pickings in a North or South American population, for example, as the material presented by Franz Boas or someone else allows us to do. And just as good for looking for the model of what happens in the Oedipal conflict, when precisely knowledge as such arises in the interior of the myths at this or that point. Just as good as looking for it elsewhere in the Shakespearean creation of Hamlet, as I did for you 2 years ago, and as moreover I had every right to do, since right from the start Freud had taken things in that way. You have seen that what we thought we were able to connote is something that gets modified into another point in the structure, and in a particularly gripping way, since it is a very particular point, aporetic for the subject, of the desiring relationship that Hamlet promotes to the level of reflection, to meditation, to interpretation, to research, to the structured headfuck that he represents. We managed to get a feel of the specificity of this case well enough, via this difference. In contrast to the father of the Oedipal murder, he, the murdered father in Hamlet, it is not he doesn't know that must be said, but he knows. Not only does he know, but this interferes with the subjective impacts that we are interested in on the central character, on the very character of Hamlet. It is a drama that takes place entirely within Hamlet as a subject. He is very much made to know that the father has been killed, and he is made to know enough about it that he knows a lot about it, right up to knowing by whom. In saying that, I am only repeating what Freud said right from the start. So here is the indication of a method with which we are asked to measure what our knowledge inserts into the function of the structure itself. Broadly speaking, and to put it in a way that allows me to locate the root of the issue here, at the source of any neurosis, as Freud said right from his first writings, there is not what has been interpreted as a frustration, something like that, a retardedness left open and formless, but a Versagen, withholding, meaning something that is much closer to a refusal than to frustration, that is as much internal as it is external, that is truly put by Freud in a position to connote here with this term, even though it has vulgarized resonances in our contemporary language, in a position that is existential. This position does not posit the normal, the possibility of the Versagen, then neurosis, but an original Versagen beyond which there will be the path, the bifurcation either of the neurosis or of the normal, the one being neither more or less likely than the other in relation to this point of departure of the possibility of the Versagen. And what the term Sagen, to say, implies in this untranslatable Versagen jumps out at us. It is only possible in the register of the Sagen, I mean, insofar as the Sagen is not simply the operation of communication, but the to say, the emergence as such of the signifier as enabling the subject to refuse. What I can tell you is that this original primordial refusal, this potentially injurious power that relates to our whole practice, it is not possible to get away from it. In other words, we analysts, we only operate, and who doesn't know it, in the register of the Versagen, and that is all the time. And it is insofar as we steal ourselves away, and who doesn't know it, that our whole practice, our technique is structured around something that can be expressed in a totally stammering way in the idea of non-gratification that was never used anywhere by Freud. It is a question of looking into what this Versagen stipulates in more depth. This Versagen implies a progressive direction that is the one that we bring into play in analytical practice.